there's always one that clearly comes to mind for this. Yeah, we're going in the sort of Wayback Machine to the year 2010, in Meru National Park, Kenya. And this is, I had been guiding a bit up until that point. I really kind of started expedition leadership and guiding in 2003, I believe. But as you can imagine, the amount that I'm guiding today is so much more. So I still kind of felt sort of green at that point, but I had dozens of expeditions under my belt. So I kind of felt like I was really getting in the groove of it. And this one, of course, just totally threw everything for a loop. But like all stories, stories are made when it hits the fan. And yeah, it's a wild one. So yeah, we're in Meru National Park in Kenya, 2010. I'm leading my first African safari. And of course, we have local guides and local naturalists and all that. But at this point, I was a graduate student studying ecotourism, and I was there with my mentor, and we were running a travel program for the Florida Museum. And so we got people that were like members and people that were local and kind of friends of friends. And so we for lack of a better word, kind of cobbled together this group of great people, about maybe like 15 guests, something like that. So we're, if you know the safari industry, we're in about 3 different vehicles. So the adventure, the way that I had planned those safaris is we were all rather local to the Gainesville, Florida area. Maybe a couple people flew differently, but at that point, not having planned a lot of travel, but how do I put this? I thought it was the expectation to like plan everybody's flights and fly with them and go over there. This trip was one of my big lessons is to don't do that. Let guests fly on their own, get there on their own, have someone ready to pick them up. But like trying to do that and guiding a trip it's just too much of a storm. Anyway, I digress. So it started off with a rainy afternoon in Gainesville, Florida, getting ready to fly across the Atlantic over to Nairobi, Kenya. And so in the summer, I think it was an August trip because we were timing it to hit the migration in the Masai Mara kind of perfectly. And Florida thunder showers in the afternoon can be pretty commonplace. And again, another learning experience is try not to get an afternoon flight out of Florida for like a big adventure, because if thunderstorms get pretty hairy, which they can do, it just shuts the whole place down. So this is like a multi-part story, but I'll make this part of the story short. We fly out of Gainesville, we fly to Jacksonville. So we're like, a 2-hour car ride away, but we took a quick puddle jump flight just so we could be on staging ground and make the big flight. Anyway, massive thunderstorms roll in, flight from Jacksonville to, I think it was to maybe Amsterdam and then to Nairobi. But anyway, it was the big international flight, gets canceled. And it is just a total mess. Like it's weird to say, but like the airline industry, I think has gotten a lot better in the last decade. And so just, think back almost 15 years ago, and it was just a total mess. And so, I'm on the phone with like different travel agents and folks that help book us. And we're, I've got my co-guide standing in line at like the Delta counter that's now 200 people long. This is a big international flight. And so the trip starts off with like, I have, basically 15 people under my watch, and like, I have all their records, all their booking, like it's my show. And the flight gets canceled, and, their alternative is like, oh, well, the next flight that we automatically rebook you on is like 4 days from now.
Oh,
I'm
no.
like, that is not acceptable. Like, you can't miss that much of a safari like that. It's ruined, like. So anyway, so the trip starts off on this really kind of crummy note. We get everybody, again, part of the issue with like flying when everybody's under your command is like, I had to get the hotel for the night because, well, I'm just going to go to the airport at 4 a.m. when the first desk for the first flight opens, and I'm just going to hound them to get this group of 15 people on the next flight. Like, it's one thing if it's like you and your partner or whatever, like,
Right.
you can sneak, but like 15 people is kind of an act of God. So to this day, I don't know exactly how I did it, but I went just with like game face on, and I got everybody booked on the first flight. You can imagine the logistics of like telling people when you go to bed, like, hey, I might be calling you at 5 a.m. to get packed and ready and board a flight, or I might not. I don't really know. I'm just going to see what I do. So I'm this young graduate student, and these people are trusting, but they're also like, oh my god, this young kid is like in charge of our next 3 weeks of happiness and whatnot. So the reason I'm telling this part of the story is that like it did work out. We were only one day delayed, but it kind of set us off on this like really exhausting foot. Like it was like, oh my god, what trials and tribulations. So we finally get there. We get picked up because we missed a day and a night. We essentially like just completely nixed the first overnight in Nairobi, right? It's like normally when you do a big trip, your first overnight's kind of sort of like near the arrival area just to make things smooth and easy. So we nixed that and we just went straight to the field. So we get out there and then we go to this amazing camp. It's really like it's kind of like one of the world premiere camps, especially in Kenya, called Elsa's. It looks like it's pronounced Kopje, but it's like Kope. Elsa's Kope in Meru National Park. We get there, we go on our first game drive, and it's amazing. I had not been in safari before. I don't think anybody else on the trip, except for my co-guide, had been on the safari. So they're all amazed. We're seeing elephants up close. It was awesome. And we're just like, heck yeah. And like that sigh of relief when it all works out. You're like, those last 2 or 3 days were pretty much hell, but we're here and look how awesome this is. And, since I set up the trip to have local guides and kind of directors and all that, like I knew I could, not totally go on cruise control, but like I wasn't likely to have any major logistical snafus because our partners on the ground, even if it happened, would be the ones most knowledgeable on how to solve it. So I'm like, okay, great. So we get on, the first game drive, fantastic. We go on our second game drive and we're loading the vehicles and we're just about to take off. And I'm like the last one in, and I just hear we're the last one in my vehicle. So like the other two are still loading, and I just hear this scream from not too far away just is like, help, help, help. And like you just know, like anybody out there knows when you hear this like certain tone and the frequency of help, you're like, something bad just happened. And here we are in Africa. It's like an open camp. I'm like, my mind's already wild. We run over there, and fortunately, it wasn't any sort of like wildlife issue. But one of the guests, just coming out of her room, probably tired from travel and all that, just made a slight misstep, slipped on a little bit of gravel or something. It was like a very normal like pad, and compound fracture in her leg. Boom. And she was compound fracture, bones sticking out.
God.
Yeah, it was, and it was such an innocent little thing. Like it was nothing crazy. It wasn't like a feat of strength. And I think she was like 83, and so it's a pretty big deal. And so I go over there. I've had some first aid medical training, and again we just hear help. We see her roommate propping her up from the back, and her just sitting on the ground with like her knee up in the air. And I look down, I see like her shin, like the bottom of her pants are like it's all wet, and I'm like, oh, that's all blood. Like like her bone came out. Yeah, really, really gnarly. So that's the stage. So here we are, like kind of still exhausted, kind of elated. I'm kind of thinking of this sort of cruise control type mentality. And here I have like a major medical situation, like a day's drive from Nairobi or anywhere. Like Meru is a national park that is it's not really on the safari trail, but it's one of the biggest national parks in Kenya. And it's beautiful. It's extraordinary. It's not going to compare to like the Masai Mara or some of the more iconic ones that are just like chock full of wildlife, but there is great stuff there. But as a result, it's really, really remote. Like the beauty of it is it's super duper remote. And so then the lodge manager comes over and we're like assessing the situation. We're like, holy cow, the first thing we need to do is take care of this bone. Cause like what happens when a compound fracture is like the tendons and ligaments and all the stuff kind of constrict and kind of make it perpetually worse if you don't initially address the bone that's now poking out of the skin. And then you have risk of infection and all sorts of stuff. So, he gets a elementary school ruler basically as a makeshift split, and we get like rubber bands and t-shirts and tape, and we're like taping her just to stabilize. Meanwhile, she is a trooper of all troopers. Like she's not crying, she's not wincing, she's like, thank you for helping. Let me know what I need to do. Yeah, and so, then, the next thing is to call what's called the flying doctors. And unfortunately, I have not had to deal with them since, but at that time, there is a company, I don't know if it's like nonprofit or what, but they're basically just doctors that are kinda like on standby at major airports, I think around Africa, but definitely in Kenya. And we mobilized them, and, this is a full-on medical evacuation, like a really big deal. And so they fly in this private airplane, with all the medical supplies, kind of like a mobile hospital that can fly. And they land in the airstrip. You can imagine the logistics of like getting this. Like, where are you? Okay, gotcha. What's the situation? What do we need to bring with us? Like anticipating supplies and gear and medications and whatnot. And so then they get to the airstrip. The airstrip's like an hour and a half away or something. It's not real close, or at least it seemed like that. I mean, this is all like triage blur. So we're just there with this lady for sitting on this gravel, trying to make her as comfortable as possible for like 3+ hours. We're on a satellite phone, like calling her family members and just being like, listen, this we definitely need to like let you guys know what's happening. We probably are gonna need some assistance. Like we don't think she's going to be able to make it back to the U.S. on her own. This is a full-on medical evacuation. And so we call the family. They're of course appreciative and understanding. And this is still even like in the early days of, or in my opinion, the early days of satellite phones. But nevertheless, we do all this. Family's notified. The flying doctors finally come in. They are in this bumpy back of a pickup truck with like a full stretcher. We get her on there. We kind of have to like make it underneath her, just the way the stretcher works. And the whole time I can just see her leg like kind of moving. She's holding it. We've got it splinted. We've got people holding it, but it had to be painful. And so I felt so bad seeing this. And so we finally get her. We get her in the back of the pickup truck, which this is all like the most expeditious way to get her from point A to point B, from the field to a hospital in Nairobi, which actually has very, very good hospitals and doctors. So we get her there, and we finally get her to this airstrip, and this is in the afternoon, and it's taken a long time, just because they're kind of like splinting with medical devices, and they're getting some medication in her to help dull the pain, taking really good care of her. But then we get in the plane like all secured, and so then I go back with her to Nairobi. I volunteer. My co-guide is going to lead the rest of the expedition. I'm going to go back, make sure she gets adequate care or great care. And so I'm sitting in the plane, and now with all this time, the sun is starting to set. And these are all like, all these bush planes are all visual flight rules. And so if it gets pitch black, like that plane may not take off, and we may have another night. Like it's just, all these like worst case
Oh my
scenario things running through
gosh.
your head. And so then there's a doctor and then there's a nurse. And so I'm in the back of the cabin, basically, like completely hauled out with a stretcher. And, the nurse is putting in IVs and, giving me the bag of fentanyl to hold up over my head so it drips
Oh my
appropriately in
god.
her, and then the doctor is the pilot. So he's in the front, and he's getting all these instruments and like pushing things and cranking these, and meanwhile the sun is setting, or the African sunset was like this blood red sunset, very, very ominous. And he gets us in position, and then he kind of like backs off and sort of starts like shut things down. I'm like, oh gosh, what happened now? So fresh in my mind of like airplane woes and travel woes of like issues. We've all been in the plane, and we like hear the engines turn off, like for big commercial flights. Like, what what are we going to hear about maintenance issues now? So anyway, he's kind of slowed things down, not shut things off, but then he starts like swatting at things in the cockpit. He's got this like bag, and he's like scooping things, and it turns out that well, there are tsetse flies in the
Oh
plane. and,
no.
and so and this guy is an African, and Africans are not afraid of much. They're not afraid of lions. They're not afraid of elephants, but they are quite afraid of tsetse flies because it's possible vector for African sleeping sickness, a pretty major disease. And so for some reason, instead of just like swatting them or killing them, there were like 6 of them in there. They were flying all around. He's bagging them with like these Ziploc bags and like keeping them as if to like study, like how you would like a goldfish at a carnival. He's like scooping it, blowing air, and like twisting it off and like tying it. And so here in the seat next to him, there's like these piles of tsetse flies and bags. I was like, this could not get any freaking weirder.
Oh my
Um,
god.
And so fortunately, we rumble down the strip, the airstrip. We do take off, hour flight or something like that, get into Nairobi. And of course, it's all just beginning basically. Like now we got to get her to the hospital. We got to get her checked out. We got to figure out how many days. We got to figure out like how family's going to come in and take her back. And, she was given really, really great care, but had to be like rushed into, emergency surgery because with compound fractures, like you can get like infections in those bones pretty quickly. So immediately into surgery. And it was like just 3 days of checking on her morning, noon, and night, make sure she's doing well. But then by the time her son, her family was able to get to the hospital, it was like 3 or 4 days. And so this whole ordeal is just kind of going on and kind of hitting this plateau. And it was just like the wildest experience. There's no real crescendo to this. She got out safely and she went back home, and then she was under medical care from her physician, and I believe she probably had to have another surgery or so, because it's a challenging thing. So yeah, that was the crazy experience of my first medical evac. That was, well, they're all unexpected, but it was unexpected how wild it was. But fortunately, she was all right in the end. But yep, through a lot of craziness. And it can happen at any time. It can happen at any time. So anyway, that's my big medical evac story. That's when things don't go according to plan in rural, remote Kenya.